Welcome to the Edges of Lean. I'm Bella Engelbach, and in this podcast we explore the human and creative side of lean thinking, unusual places where lean thinking is practiced. We meet people who are practicing continuous improvement in many different flavors and styles. So come along with me on a journey to the edges of lean.
Episode 25, Continuous Improvement and Getting to the Root of Belonging. My guest today is Sonia Lewis. You'll find Sonia on the front lines of many social justice movements as she works to change the many systemic, institutional, and structural inequities. For over a decade, Sonia has been on a mission to marry equity and humanity work with social justice and the cultural shifting of mindsets. At the end of the day, her battle cry is, the future is anti-racist, and we all have a part to play. We're talking about the part the continuous improvement professional has to play in anti-racism. Sonia Lewis, welcome to the Edges of Lean.
Thank you so much, Bella. I appreciate the time and the platform and opportunity to be here with you today.
And I appreciate your time as well. And it's really been interesting to get to know you and to learn about what it is that you are doing and the direction that you are taking your work. Can you start out by telling us a little bit about Sonia? How did you get to where you are today? What's been your path?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, to say the least. I can remember things in my background that have definitely influenced who and how I have shown up in spaces today, particularly my parents. Both came to and migrated to California for different reasons, but very similar reasons when it comes to opportunity, when it comes to race relations. My mother was a Midwest girl who grew up in the projects of Chicago. Her family, unfortunately, was dislocated. They owned their home, they owned businesses, and lived in a segregated part of Chicago's West End during the 1950s. And when the big freeway project was brought to Chicago, their community was the one that was demolished. And so they were then all displaced and moved into what we now know as projects in Chicago. And she made it her mission when she graduated high school: I am leaving this place and I am never going to subjugate my children to live in an apartment. She didn't even think about projects, like that would never cross her mind, but even an apartment. So I had the luxury and benefit of never living in an apartment, but poverty was still very much a part of what my background and growing up was. On the other hand, my father is a very Southern boy from the state of Texas. You know, he grew up, all of his siblings, 13 of them, were born at home, again, because folks in the Black community were not allowed to birth babies in hospitals. And he picked cotton and other things that were crops there. They were part-time sharecroppers. And his opportunity to come to California was when he was in middle school and high school. And he said, I'm following my big sister so that I can have more, opportunities than just working the farm. I mean, just living and recognizing the things that my parents went through, it provided me with a very sustainable and direct and intentional view of the world and who I was and how I fit into that world. So at the age of 7, I refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I got in a lot of trouble. But my mother was my biggest advocate and cheerleader. And I can remember verbatim when she came into that principal's office, she says, you know what, I'm standing with her and I don't know what I'm going to do with her. I don't have all the answers, but I'm standing with her. And so that kind of was my beginning to how I then decided to go into things around and always gravitating to things around equity. That's long story short, I was a high school teacher for several years, and then I became an equity broker and an anti-racism impact strategist.
So when you say equity, Sonia, what do you mean by that?
It's funny. Sometimes people say, don't you mean equality? No, I don't want the equal inequality. Equality. That is very opposite of what equity is. Equity is assessing the needs of individuals and organizations and communities, and providing them with the resources that will make it at least an even playing field. And if I can be truthful and honest, equity is just the launching pad, right? The real goal would be liberation. Like, imagine a world where we all could live, and our resources that we contribute to the society that we pay via taxes and just contribute via the workplace, that if all of those things brought actual liberation to folks, I think that we would treat each other with more humanity.
So when you go into an organization to work with them on equity, and you also talk about belonging, which I think is, doesn't sound like a very corporate word. Yeah. How do you approach that in an organization? I would imagine usually you've been invited in. Is that right? I mean, you're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so most of my clients come to me by word of mouth or referral. And when I have that first assessment session with them, it's a matter of getting to the root of where folks don't feel like they belong. And in those conversations, I attempt to convince the person who's the decision maker that belonging is going to impact positively your bottom line in production. And if your goal is production and to generate more revenue for your business, or to serve more people in community, if we're talking about a nonprofit organization, if we're talking about an educational organization, if we want to produce better, high achieving students, then we have to get at the root of belonging. And belonging really is a matter of people wanting to show up and feeling like they are a part of, and that their voice is being heard. It's almost like teaching people how to advocate for themselves, and that their agency within that organization is important. But we have to teach people that, because we have been conditioned for so long in America to be and work in this capitalistic, competitive system that sometimes disenfranchises people, and then they don't get heard, and then they hate coming to work every day, and then the work doesn't get done in the most effective way.
So one of the things that I've seen in organizations is that there are people who don't have a problem with belonging, because for some reason that they feel as if, they're going to belong, they're going to be listened to. And I'll give a shout out to Mark Graben, who is an amazing person in the lean community. Mm-hmm. And Mark has said, as a white man, he didn't realize. He had never been to a place where he didn't felt that he didn't belong there, right, or he couldn't say something. But for a lot of other people, it doesn't feel that way. Absolutely. So you're going into organizations then, and what you're talking about is really going to the heart of a culture that is maybe invisible to a lot of people. Absolutely. In the organization.
Absolutely. And so the two first approaches that I try to leverage in the beginning is one is curating a safe space for brave conversations to take place. Folks have to feel like that they are in a space where it is healthy and safe for them to open up and express and be vulnerable. I use a lot of Brene Brown's work when it comes to vulnerability and blame and shame, because we truly are living in a very urgent reality when it comes to the collision of two pandemics, the pandemic of COVID and the pandemic of racism. And so now that a lot of organizations are taking it upon themselves to not only acknowledge that racism is actually a thing that has harmed huge segments of our greater society, that they want to put their money where their mouth is, but they just don't know how. And organizational leaders and corporate executives in particular are struggling with the language. And so I come in to first establish, like, this is a safe space. We are going to talk about social emotional intelligence from an adult perspective. And then we are going to create some dialogue around shared language and values so that we can see each other for who we are. We all come to the table with baggage, and that baggage, those lived experiences, are important to how people show up in the workplace.
So Sonia, I'm thinking about the folks, a lot of the folks who listen to this podcast, who are working inside organizations. Some of them are working as an internal continuous improvement consultant. Others are working as external consultants. And there's a massive opportunity there as they're working on process, which usually means you end up working on culture, to also start to address and to move equity, belonging, really valuing each other for each other along. In fact, that's what we talk about in Lean, right? We talk about respect for people and this idea that all human beings are absolutely marvelous. What kind of work would a continuous improvement consultant need to do? But I would say, especially someone who's white, we'll start there, need to do with themselves to start to get, I wouldn't say comfortable, at least start the practice of addressing equity, along with how do we make this process work better?
Yeah. That's a good question. And so what I share with people is we have to remove self from the equation, in the sense that this isn't an attack on individuals. This is a culture shift of systems, right? That there are some flaws within our system that we've allowed to perpetuate for several centuries. And it's now time to actually recognize that the flaws are harming everyone in the system. And so we can be a cog in the wheel, or we can be a pathway to progress. And so what that looks like for individuals who come from privileged backgrounds, and not always are those points of privilege and proximities to whiteness. It's not always white men, for example. It is individuals who recognize that they have earned college degrees, or they live in certain neighborhoods, and they see other people in community not like themselves. And so that's the disconnect and the dysfunction that we've allowed as a society. And so I always urge people to take yourself out of the situation, because when you focus on yourself, you are always going to feel like blame and shame is going to be a part of, and it is going to derail any kind of progress. It is going to keep that barrier and wall up from allowing anything to penetrate, and the rational you cannot show up. The authentic you cannot show up. And so I'm asking people to be vulnerable and to listen, and just be present. And silence is okay, right? Silence is a sign of growth, but also silence is indicative of violence on other people. And we don't want to be violent towards the folks that we cherish within our teams.
So when you say that the silence is violence, can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. When you're in the break room and you might experience or be the witness of a microaggression or an implicit bias, and you say nothing, right? When you gaslight a person to believing that what their experience is not what you recognize of someone else. And it's very common. I've heard it throughout my career. Sonia, it didn't happen like that way. That person's not racist, or that person's not sexist. And I'm like, you can say that from the lens from which you see the world, but from the lens in which I see the world is very different. And so what I'm asking people to do is to a little bit of walking in someone else's shoes. And so I do things like privilege walks with teams. I do things like affinity grouping, so that people can really express based on their commonalities. And then I report data back to the decision makers and the folks who can actually impact the dynamics of said organizations. But it is a matter of, at the end of the day, taking self out of the center of the equation and making it about shifting culture for the dynamic and system to work much better.
Wow. So when somebody is working in an organization, what would you want them to be looking for signs that equity is lacking, that belonging is lacking?
Yeah.
What would be the things that would, we talk about in Lean about doing a waste walk and be able to walk through, somewhere and see the waste, right?
Yeah.
So how do we develop those? What are the sort of the microscope or the glasses that we would have to start to see that as you work inside an organization?
Yeah. I would say definitely start with your mission and vision statements in mind. I mean, lots of organizations around the world have these mission and vision statements that are so like, um, just, I want to do this. We want to achieve this, right? But it's so disconnected from either the people that you serve or the people that you employ. And so, one, you want to look at that mission and vision statement and make sure it is aligned with the people that you serve, your customers, and or your employees that you have as part of your team. The second piece of that is representation. I believe that representation, if we're going to talk about equity, we have to talk about it from a lens of who are we bringing to the table, and not just who's the face of your company, but who is making decisions, who are in leadership positions. What are the access points to moving up in your company and organization? Those things need to be reevaluated. But also, there's this third piece that I think gets lost in the sauce a little bit, because we all have, HR handbooks and we have policies and procedures, but every organization has a culture. And there's always that one gatekeeper that kind of dictates everything and how everything moves. And oftentimes I say, take the microphone from that one person and give it to and pass the mic around to several individuals so that we can hear the voices of many instead of the voices of few. And so those are three tips that I tell organizations. It is definitely not a matter of we have to deconstruct all the way down to the root, but for some organizations, it is a matter of getting all the way down to the basics, because the alignment piece with what you want as your outcome at the end of the day is so off mark. And that's where we get to making some connections and building some bridges.
But you have to align to something, right? So,
Yes.
So I think what you're saying, starting with the vision and the mission, where is this organization saying it's going? You can't understand what's happening at the bottom, or you can't put that into context unless you've started by looking at what the intention of the organization is. Yeah. Yeah. So I think of situations, a lot of times when we're working on process, we're working on process that crosses departments. We're working on process that crosses different levels in an organization, and in lean and continuous improvement thinking, we talk a lot about taking silos away, not making sure that we're bringing in the right people, the people who are really involved in doing the work before you change the work. What might stop somebody who's been brought into that kind of work from contributing in the way that we would want them to contribute?
At the core of all the questions that I get asked, I always try to bring belonging back to it. Like, if we can figure out, how to incorporate a sense of belonging at every level, I think that people are more willing to show up in their authentic selves and do the work. I also challenge organizations and teams to evaluate their turnover, right? Try to figure out why people are leaving your organization, right? It's interesting. I was working with a university system here in California, and they, for the first time, figured, they wanted to listen to some of their employees who have been saying for years, we need to celebrate, the fact that we have a diverse community, but we really need to reevaluate how the lack of access and mobility within the organization is for people of color, for women, for people who are in the LGBTQ plus community. And so looking at those pain points for individuals is going to elevate the entire group, because I'm of the philosophy, when the most disenfranchised person in community has an opportunity to have access to and feels included and has a sense of belonging, that everyone within that organization is also going to benefit. And so that it's not a matter of what are we taking away from someone who has historically been in a position of power. It's a matter of sharing the space, sharing those opportunities to lead.
So I'm thinking as you're talking about that, or I was thinking, there are going to be some people who will feel, and we do see this in society, if this person gets this time, this space, gets to raise this particular flag, somehow that's taking something away from me, right? But what you're saying is it's not really taking something away from you. I think because the organization as a whole benefits, and if the organization as a whole benefits, that benefits everybody in the organization. It should benefit everybody in the organization.
And it's interesting. We are living in a time, unfortunately, that is extremely hypersensitive to just the ideations of race relations, white supremacy, and the white normative. And I would ask people to reflect on the fact that historically in this country, that there has been a certain group of individuals who have had the benefit and privilege of access and generational wealth and education and things being passed down from generation to generation. And because of the way the system is set up, it is also preventing other folks in community to have those same access points. And so it's not a matter of taking anything away from, we live in a very, I say, a rich resource country, right? And so oftentimes we get caught up believing that it is there are deficits. And we can't, fall back on the sword of, if I give up this for someone else to have a benefit that is taking away from me, there's enough to go around for everyone.
So when you're working with an organization, Sonia, and you start to see change happening, what are some of the signs that the work that you're doing is starting to bear fruit?
Yeah. So either one of three things happen, like the entire group begins to just create a beautiful, different synergy, right? There is a welcoming when you come into that space that is inviting, it's fresh. You begin to see the shift and incorporation of various voices rather than one voice. The second thing that sometimes happens in these shifts, these cultural shifts, and I say cultural shifts because we know that in order to make anything be impactful, at least for sustainable and long term, we're talking about 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year. And these are commitments, right? Mm-hmm. Because when you think about children and how they grow up, what is that growth spurt at those ages, 1, 3, and 5? We know right from wrong, psychologists say between the ages of 3 and 5. And so we can begin to see, that there are some pain points when people are not included. And so the second thing that often happens is the very opposite end. People begin to leave our organizations that don't feel like they fit because the new way of doing things, that culture shift, is just causing too much discomfort for them, the individual, right? They're not taking into consideration the totality of the whole group. And then there's this middle group, and it usually gets smaller and smaller until mind shifts begin to happen and take place. But there will be individuals who will be like, I'm not going anywhere, and they will build a wall around themselves, and then they will alienate themselves from the process. All three of those vantage points are important. They are important to reevaluate and reassess annually. And then as we are doing those things on a regular basis, we begin to recognize that, the shift is happening in a positive direction. And then also try to incorporate ways that we can bring in and ask questions, as in the form of surveys, of how are we doing? Let's do some barometer checks around how are we doing? Do you feel like we're making progress? And keeping that on the forefront of our minds as well.
And that would be another opportunity then also for conversations and listening as well, especially depending on the size of the organization. I know there's some organizations you're never going to have a conversation with everybody, right? And others, like that pulse survey could really, really provide you with some great data. Yeah. So one of the things that I've seen in my work a lot is in terms of belonging. You've talked about race. You've talked about sexism. The other isms kind of play in there, homophobia. Different religions, different creeds. These can all like get in between us or make us feel like we don't belong. But there's one that I don't hear talked about much, and you and I have not talked about this before the podcast, so So feel free to say, I don't really want to talk about that if you don't want to. But that is kind of a classism that comes out. If you say yes, that's good. That comes out of education, where we will see, for example, I come from the pharmaceutical industry. You will see in some pharmaceutical companies that the people who are MD, PhDs really don't associate with the people who have a mere college graduates, who don't associate with the people on the line who may be high school graduates or not have the education at all. So I think that, there's definitely a class piece, but there's also this, education and training piece. And I think we see it in engineering-based companies too, where the engineers, you kind of other the people. I've seen it where people have sort of othered, well, here are the strategists and here are the operations people. Well, if you didn't have the operations people, the strategy is not going anywhere. But there's this othering that happens all the time. And sometimes I think that is mixed up with race as well, because there is clearly, a difference in racial makeup between one group and another. Is that something that is valuable? I don't want to say call out, because you don't want to be, maybe you do want to call it, but is that something to make people aware of?
I think it's definitely something to make people aware of. While it's important and imperative that we work on our teams to get the bottom line of whatever our goal and projects that we're working on, I think it's also imperative that we shake and mix things up and try to do that at least on a quarterly to biannual basis, at the very minimum on an annual basis. How are we creating teams so that you have one person from each of those departments or a variety of people from various departments to work on projects? Because at the end of the day, when you have people from various vantage points being able to bring solutions, right? Because at the end of the day, we want solutions, and making sure that we're providing the tangible deliverable to our client or to our customers, right? And so it's important that we shake that up a bit so that we don't get used to the same old individuals being the ones that we lean on. I see this in the media industry. I see this in the medical profession. I see this in the education profession, where they have kind of mastered doing this cross collaboration pieces that work really, really well. And I would encourage other industries to consider that working in silos is also going to prevent you from having everyone feel like they belong. And at the end of the day, I always go back to belonging is going to improve your bottom line. It's going to increase productivity. It is going to make people feel like they want to get up every day and go and tackle that one problem. We're living under the age of trying to figure out this COVID thing, right? And imagine those scientists every day going to those pharmaceutical companies, not wanting to get up and go to work because they were othered, but they know the importance of this work. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think of things from that perspective. My work is important and my part of that work is important. And so I need to show up so that I can be included.
On the sort of the flip side of that, we have people who are reacting to this kind of work by saying, well, now I can't say anything. I can't do anything. Everything, I have to be too politically correct. Is this the term I'm allowed to use today? How do you get somebody to feel comfortable? I think you alluded to this before, to feel comfortable saying, I don't actually know how to do this, right? I don't know what are the right words to use. I kind of resent being told I have to change my language, or when I did this, it was a microaggression. How do you get those people to come along?
Yeah, so there's two ways that I get people to come along, and one is super important, and I'm getting lots of calls from corporate leaders and execs right now. I'm not ready, and can you help me get ready? Because I know that the hammer's going to come down soon, that I have to do this, right? I have to do some equity work. I have to do some anti-racism work. I have to do some gender equity work. And so I do a one-on-one coaching with corporate leaders and executives, just preparing them for what it means to be courageous and lead. And to lead while learning, right? Because we don't have to know it all when we show up in spaces. And we have to, for some leaders, it's, we've gotten into this state of being that we know it all because we've been with the company and they wouldn't have selected me if I weren't qualified. But if you take out the learning piece in any position, you are doing yourself and your company a disservice. So I would first start with, if there's corporate executives or organizational leaders who just feel like they're not ready, we do some one-on-one coaching to help you get ready. It's a matter of, being confident in the fact that I don't know it all. And then the second thing that I would bring to the team in general is that we have to create shared language and shared dialogue and shared values around what we see is important. And so when we understand the nuances, and sometimes they are nuances, and I say there are two things that typically are happening. Like, there are individuals who are just unintentionally racist or sexist, right? It's just the way that we've been, conditioned. And I can even say that as a Black, dark-skinned woman in this country, that I have privileges that sometimes I didn't intend for someone to take it that way. But because we've been conditioned to behave and speak and interact in a certain way, it has become the norm. And so we want to break down those type of barriers so that folks feel validated and that they feel important. And the only way for you to do that is to offer, like, what are the things that you're experiencing? Bring those back to the folks who are the decision makers, your leaders within those organizations, and then bring the whole team together to address those issues. But it has to be a safe space. It has to be one in which people feel like they can be heard.
Which means that the executive themselves has to create that safe space. They have to. Absolutely. They have to allow for for people to say the thing that perhaps, that would be the wrong thing to say.
Yeah. And that's a very tricky, line to tread sometimes. It's a very thin rope, and, you can fall off one way or the other and offend someone within your organization. But I think the first piece that organizational leaders and corporate executives need to do, as well as organizations as a whole, is to acknowledge. That acknowledgement piece will bring down the walls and the angst and anxiety of a lot of people in the room if you acknowledge that the issue even exists. So, like, since George Floyd, there have been lots of corporate organizations around the country who are throwing millions and millions of dollars at equity work and anti-racism work, and saying that we are, from this day forward, going to create anti-racist work environments, right? But what I'm seeing is the failure to actually make a commitment to the long term of the work, the long term that's required when you have a cultural shift. I have, for a long time, I've been doing this work for over a decade now. And for a long time, I've said, I'm not your typical DEI company. I don't help you check boxes, cross T's and dot I's. I don't do a one and done, because I know that people will go back to their old habits if they're not pushed and challenged just a little bit to be more vulnerable. And that vulnerability is going to open up a person's opportunity to grow and see other people as they would see themselves. And we have to validate where we are at intersections. Everyone comes with a level of trauma and experience in their lifetime. And so we want to make sure that people can see the intersections and the value that we all bring to the table.
It's really interesting because I've been interviewing folks over the past few weeks, and it seems we seem to come to the same theme every single time, which is what it's about, the leaders deliberately working on creating a safe space.
Yeah.
Right. And that's absolutely the last thing that some leaders have been trained or developed to do, right? They've been trained to be, to be a great market strategist, or to be a great product developer, or or to be the person who can get the venture capital for the company. They haven't been someone who's trained to create a safe space. And so I was wondering, Sonia, if you were in charge And you've been a high school teacher, but if you were in charge in education, what would you be teaching in high school, in a college, in business school, and in medical school?
Oh my goodness. It would definitely be something around humanity and connecting folks. So I have a background. My BA is in history and psychology. I have a dual degree. And then I have my teaching credential where I just love to create curriculum and develop programs, right? And so I would be my focus, if I were teaching in some capacity, would be around building leaders, building future leaders to be cognizant and conscious of the social impact of what it means to relate to one another. Part of my work, I do a lot of charity work. I have a nonprofit, and within that nonprofit, we always talk about things from a social justice lens. Like, we can look at our community, we can figure out what are the things that are not right within our community, and then young people are so genius. I truly believe that they are so genius that they can figure out the solutions to solving said problems without all of the traditional means of having to go to this entity and this government agency and present something in such a professional way that when you get to the root of this is what the problem is and here's how we can solve the problem and do it within the community because we are enough to solve our own problems, is eye-opening for a lot of people. And I think that leaders would do themselves a huge service if they leaned on the people that are within their ranks, because talent is talent. You cannot, ignore the fact that you have these people on your teams for a reason. And so it's a matter of listening. It's a matter of coming to the table and say, I'm here to learn too.
Wow. Yeah. So you'd be running the Sonia Lewis School of Empathy. And
I love that. I love that.
And I know some folks who would want to teach in that school along with you, which is great.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get back just for a minute to this idea of, especially if somebody who's working inside an organization on process. And, as I said, when you work on process, you usually end up working on culture, because in order to maintain your new process, you probably have to change the culture of the organization to do that. But I think it's easy for somebody going in who's working on process to say, well, that's my remit. That's what I'm getting paid for, is to have the flow of the material move this way rather than that way and reduce the waste. Why is it important that people working inside organizations who have the opportunity to make change, why is it important that they also work on equity and belonging?
Perspective is everything. The lenses from which we see the world and how we see structures of power are everything. Think about it from the basic standpoint. You have an organization and they offer X amount of benefits to their employees, right? And imagine a person who potentially is a single mom who needs daycare and after school, particularly so that she can do and show up in her best form of herself while at work, but has to travel into a certain part of the city, which to get home is going to take a huge chunk of her day. And so thinking about ways that we can incorporate tangible things that are going to make her life easier within those benefit package. Thinking about if there were a person who were on your team who was part of the LGBTQ plus community, and to be their authentic selves, they required a surgery that isn't covered in your medical plan. Thinking about how you can make that more equitable for that person. Thinking about when we think about equity, when we think about, just the sure notion of something as basic as restroom access, right? Mm-hmm. Women's restrooms tend to, get fuller because we actually have to go into a stall and it takes us a little bit longer to do our due than it does men. And men can, sometimes, depending on the man, be in and out.
As long as they wash their hands.
Right.
Yeah.
But those are all equity issues. I mean, think about the individual who might be Muslim or Jewish and they have various holidays that come up within their faith and religion, and they don't have the opportunity to have a space. I have a son who's 27, and he has taken on the Muslim religion, and there's a time in the day where he wants to be able to practice his prayer, and he needs to have a space in any job that he has for those 20 to 20 minutes to lay down his mat and say his prayers. And so that's important, to people. That's equity, and that's a fostering of belonging. And so, we might not have all of the answers, and we might not say the right things all of the time, but it's an acknowledgement that humanity is important, and that if humanity is important, that means everyone who shows up is important. And so we have to figure out ways to make sure that that talent that they show up with is accentuated to the best degree possible.
And I think there's some really practical things in there that you said that really would impact even on the most basic, continuous improvement work. So then if you're thinking about scheduling, are you doing scheduling in such a way that the person who has to take a child to daycare may have to take 2 buses to get in, or may have to rearrange daycare if you rearrange their schedule without notifying them ahead of time? If you're doing that, that person is definitely going to feel less engaged, right? They're going to feel less belonging. They're going to feel less engaged, and they're not going to bring their best self to work. And the same thing with space. If you're thinking about your son and other Muslim people, you're reorganizing the line in a plant. Can you reorganize the line to create some space for him, but maybe also for the nursing mothers? How can you use the work that we do in such a way that you can build equity? And then I think what you're saying is once you start to build equity and belonging, then you're also going to improve the organization. The organization will be more successful because people will be more engaged. But you got to ask questions first, right? You got to find out
tough questions. You have to figure out. And it's not a matter of, like I said, taking away anything from anyone else. This is about bringing access points for everyone within organizations. I, as a former high school teacher, I can remember there was a time period when my boys were like staggered, and it was like, I can't get them to 3 schools in a timely manner in order to be for a first period class. And I went to my principal and I was like, it would be really helpful if I can have a first period prep. I was, because of the position that I had, I was eligible for 2 prep periods throughout the day. And so I always had an end of the day prep, which was good. But the mornings were my struggle. It's not a matter of, can I get up early enough and can I have my kids prepared? For a kindergartner, it's unsafe for them to be on the school campus alone if I drop them off too early. And so making those simple maneuvers to make sure that folks can show up in their best forms of themselves is huge to that piece of production, right? I couldn't be my best self if my worry was, oh my God, that one of my children get breakfast because we got there a little bit too late, right? Or, just little things like that give a mother, anyone, some sort of peace of mind as they're going about their day and interacting with their work.
Wow. So lots of ways that we can, in continuous improvement, move this forward, and good reasons why we should do it, apart from it being the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
So Sonia, can you give us your website? How do people find you?
Absolutely. So my business is Ascribe, ASCRIBE, Educational Consulting, and we are at www.ascribesuccess.com. Super easy. We are on social media, Facebook and Instagram, as well as Ascribe Success, and on Twitter as Ascribe Ed. And we're open, feel free to reach out I tell organizations or leaders within their teams and say, feel free to reach out for a free consultation. We are here to just figure out what are the best access points to bring this kind of work and these kind of conversations to your teams so that at the end of the day, your production is at a higher level.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. So what would be your advice, Sonia, to someone starting out in their career? You have young people in your family. What's your advice to them?
Trust your gut. I have two creeds. One would be trust your gut. Your gut is very intuitive as to who you are, and you should trust it. And then the second thing, there's an old saying that my grandmother used to say, and may she rest in peace, but I live by: a closed mouth doesn't get fed. And it's this old country philosophy of, if you don't ask, you don't know who might tell you yes, right? But if you don't ask, you might know where someone stands in a certain, on a certain topic. And so a closed mouth doesn't get fed. And I don't want folks to starve. And so I want to give people agency and opportunity to advocate for themselves. And so I give you permission, ask away, because you don't know what the outcome might be.
Great advice. Thank you. Absolutely. Sonia Lewis, thank you so much for traveling with me to the edges of lean.
Thank you.
This is Bella Engelbach, and I'd like to thank Sonia Lewis for being my guest on the edges of lean. What is your part to play in anti-racism? We'd love to hear from you. Find Sonia at https://www.ascribesuccess.com or on LinkedIn. Find me at leanforhumans.com or also on LinkedIn, or comment wherever it is that you watch or listen. No matter how you travel to the edges of lean, your ratings, reviews, and comments are greatly appreciated. Please join me in exploring more of the edges of lean. There's a lot to learn. And check out my friends in the Lean Communicators community at leancommunicators.com. You'll find more podcasts and videos with lots of great new content every week. The Edges of Lean is written and produced by Bella Engelbach. This is a Lean for Humans production.